to this piece is called Italian-Australian Creative Writing, A Brief Survey. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
The first period of Italian writing in Australia, from the 1850s to the early 1900s, is characterized by accounts of travel and of Australia's physical and social environment. Except for some poems by Raffaello Carboni and Pietro Baracchi and Giulia Maieroni's novel A Living Statue, 1893, creative writing does not appear as a consistent corpus until the late 1920s. Most of the poetry written in the 1920s and 30s displayed styles and techniques, odes, sonnets and ballads, that reflected the traditional Italian literary canon of past centuries, which was taught in the schools that writers attended before they migrated. The main themes represented in this corpus were personal themes, which may or may not include the migration experience, the recall of Italy's past glories, nostalgia for the pre-migration past, which for a number of poets became a productive force for understanding the dissonance between homeland culture and society and those of the adopted country, and lastly, comment on Australian events and attitudes. Only 2 works of narrative written in Italian were published in volume form during this period. The North Queensland Sugar Belt provides the setting for Filippo Sacchi's novel La Casa in Oceania, that relates the picaresque adventures of Giorgio Breglia, scion of the Piedmontese minor aristocracy who migrates to Australia as the result of a sharp decline in family fortunes. Gino Nibbi published a collection of prose writings, Il volto degli emigranti, 1937. Each of the 7 short stories and 3 brief travelogues in the collection is set in a different location, 8 of which in North Queensland, and present Nibbi's critical appraisal of Italians and Australians in the 1930s. Literary production in volume form since the late 1940s by first-generation Italian Australians has resulted in the publication of 95 volumes of poetry by 68 authors, 39 volumes of narrative by 34 authors, and 17 theatrical texts by 9 authors written in Italian, or in the case of poetry, one of Italy's major dialects. Several hundred more Italian Australians have seen their poetry and short narrative texts published in the Italian language press and in anthologies. Publication of texts in English in volume form by first-generation writers did not begin until 1973 and constitutes about 30% of the total corpus, although in some cases they are English versions either rewritten by the author or translated of previously published Italian texts. In this respect, it should be noticed that Antonio Casella is the only first-generation writer to write exclusively in English. Over the last 5 or so years, Italian texts produced by the new wave of arrivals from Italy has reversed the trend of a potential drift towards English, with the publication almost exclusively in e-book format of 1 volume of poetry, 4 volumes of narrative, and 9 of life writing/travel memoirs. One of the leading examples of these latest texts is Marco Zangari's Latino Australiana. Marco will address this topic shortly. The bulk of post-war Italian-Australian poetry by first-generation writers is written in Italian. Some 30% of texts are produced in English and about 17% in dialect, with a substantial minority of authors writing texts in 2 out of the 3 possible combinations. To date, only 1 known volume of poetry has been published by a new wave writer, Giovanni Rabito's narrative poem Nel cuore di Oz, 2012. While language choice is often determined by functional and contextual parameters, there is nevertheless a substantial overlap of thematic patterns across the three areas of language use. These thematic patterns include perceptions of the transition to a new world and a new life with its successes and failures, the migrant's reaction to and relationship with Australia, her fascination with the natural environment, bush and outback, so different from the ones he or she left behind, the Australian cityscape and the people that are found there, and lastly, the comparison between the old land and the new, in some cases viewed from the perspective of a sometimes constructive nostalgia for one's native land. Themes present in narrative texts parallel those presented in poets, but are to some extent more selective and more focused. While some narrative texts contain quite transparent autobiographical elements, others transcend the immediacy of personal vicissitudes to explore the more universal aspects of the human condition. For instance, Rosa Cappiello's Paese Fortunato. In both cases, however, common themes are those related to the cultural and social identity of the Italian-Australian community, Pino Bosi's Australia Cane, the recall of the Italian pre-migratory past, Pietro Tedeschi's Senza Camicia, and the present relationship with Italy, the critical appraisal of Australian society and traditions, Gino Nibbi's Cocktail d'Australia. That's the last. In many texts, there is an implicit critique of the Australian ruling class, and more particularly of the Italian ruling class, in many ways held responsible for the upheavals caused by the migration process. The effects of the migration process are, however, perceived differently by different writers. For some, the passage to a new world involves the realization of a richer and fuller life. For others, the long crossing has not lived up to its promise. Second-generation Italian-Australian poets are less numerous than their first-generation counterparts and write exclusively in English, although they do not completely lose sight of the cultural diversity that forms the basis of their personal and artistic origins. The part of their poetic production that engages with their non-Anglo-Celtic origins explores questions of cultural and personal identity, their relationship with their parents and grandparents and their traditions, and reflections on Italy, although some have never been there. Gary Catalano provides an interesting and emblematic example of poetry by the second generation. His early poems in particular contain a number of references to and reflections on his Sicilian roots through the exploration of the childhood and youth of his father and of his Sicilian grandparents and uncle, as well as his own childhood. A quite different approach is presented in Diana Santamaria's bilingual Christmas in the Aeolian Islands, Natale nelle Isole Eolie, a vivid recall of past traditions for children of all ages, combining poetry, music, and graphic arts. Unlike the first generation, whose narrative writing tends to present predominantly migration-related themes, not all writing by the second generation focuses on the Italian-Australian migration experience. Although it does constitute a significant and distinctive element, we need to bear in mind that it would be difficult to categorize these writings solely on this basis, as they also deal with other wider aspects of life experiences and the universal human condition. An emblematic and seminal example is Velia Ercole, whose first novel, No Escape, 1932, presents Italian-Australian themes related to migration, settlement and assimilation, while her second, Dark Windows, 1934, engages with border crossings and cross-cultural juxtapositions. Perceptions of Italy and comparisons between Italy and Australia constitute a significant set of themes in second-generation writing. Initially, Italy is seen in a negative light, a perception in part due to the stories about the difficult life conditions in Italy in the years after the end of World War II that these writers may have heard from parents, grandparents, and other family members. In Ugo Rotellini's Closing Conversation, 1986, for example, the perception of Italy conveyed to the second-generation protagonist Carlo by his parents is that of a poor country, where people do not have enough to eat and the only thing they can count on are miracles. Later writing has tended to distance itself from this linear negative stereotype and has presented Italy from a multidimensional perspective that explores the complexities of the second generation's search for ancestral, cultural and linguistic roots, as well as their connection with contemporary Italy, often perceived in terms of Carlo Levi's concept of the two Italies, namely the Italy represented by the high cultural tradition of Renaissance art and opera, contrasted with the Italy represented by the low cultural traditions of the contadini. It is with this latter Italy that the second generation writers engage and often identify. For Venero Armanno, Sicily is not a place responding to the cultural icons commonly perceived by non-Italians, such as Lavazza coffee, soccer and Versace clothing, but it is very much the traditional contadino society of the rural south with its old culture, traditions and ancient wisdom. About half of Armanno's narrative work published to date engages with the complexities of the migration and settlement experience of Sicilian Australians from the slope of Mount Etna, from its ramifications on the second and subsequent generations, and the recall of their pre-migrant past. Other writers have chosen to explore the complex and changing relationship between Italy and Australia, with the latter generally emerging in a more positive light, but at the same time exacting from some characters a considerable psychological cost. Luis Zaita, Land of Gold and Silver. The portrayal of the physical and psychological aspects of Italian-Australian space is another major theme found in the writings of the second generation. Anna Maria Dell'Oso, for example, focuses on the negotiation of liminal space relating to place, in particular the topos of the house, linked to belonging and identity, both cultural and individual. Other areas of negotiation are tensions about traditional family values seen as restrictive when compared to the apparently greater freedom enjoyed by Anglo-Australian peers. Tensions between the Australian-born second generation and their Italian-born parents is another major theme. Intergenerational clashes and the pressure to conform to Italian-Australian norms create a sense of embarrassment in second-generation participants, since these events mark them as different from their Anglo-Australian peers. However, the relationship between Italian-born grandparents and Australian-born grandchildren is, in the case of most writers, more positive, both in terms of personal rapport and as a vital link to the grandchildren's Italian heritage, continuity with the past being perceived as an important element of second-generation identity formation. See, for example, Archimede Fusillo's The Dons and Marisa Fazio's Nonna Makes Me Coffee. Given the time limit, this survey has to be brief, and obviously much more could and hopefully on another occasion should be added. Nevertheless, it is hoped that even such a brief survey can serve to illustrate that creative writing is one of the many and varied cultural practices developed by Italians who have migrated to Australia and their descendants. First generation writing engages with the expression and critique of Italian cultural values and practices, the complex appraisal of the relationship with Italy, and the equally complex relationship with the new country. These texts are often characterized by counter-discursive elements that function to interrogate and destabilize hegemonic views of nation, as well by the temporal and spatial dislocations resulting from the mapping of two overlapping cultural contexts. Despite being a largely invisible element in mainstream Australian literary culture, first-generation Italian-Australian writing can be considered as providing an interesting example of Homi Bhabha's general observation regarding the potential of Australia's pluricultural society to present views from the periphery, thus providing a significant contribution to the interrogation of the national as emergent from both local communities and global diasporas. Second-generation writing presents a variety of themes and contents that explore individual and collective experiences deriving from the post-migration and settlement processes involving Italian migrants and their descendants. These texts constitute an exploration from the inside of the long-term issues inherent in the life experiences of Italian-Australian groups and individuals that do not necessarily terminate with the first generation. The search for a dynamic equilibrium between past and present, Italian and Australian, promotes an engagement with issues of identity and ethnicity, differences between Italian and Australian cultures, the advantages and disadvantages of operating in two or more cultural contexts with the concomitant tensions of acceptance and rejection, the generational divides impacting on relationships with parents and grandparents, and lastly, the recovery and interpretation of the pre-migration past.